For the sake of this video, can we just pretend that I'm holding a mic? Thank you. So, I've always been a lover of horror, of dark and spooky things, and I think that that's something that I didn't realize always because I didn't think that the things that I loved were horror things. For example, when I was little, my favorite movies were by Tim Burton, and I never really watched like extreme horror movies that were really bloody and gross and gruesome. But I did watch things that would make maybe some other children a bit scared. I also loved books like Coraline and Ivy Pocket, and it's something that kind of stayed with me and kind of molded me. And now, when I'm grown up, I still think about it a lot, and I still think about how that little girl loved it, and how I am here now, and how I would be proud of myself because I am still a lover of horror, and now I know a bit more about it. As a genre, that was always very special to me and very dear to my heart. And this being month of horror and spooky things and Halloween, I decided that today's video I wanted to make a bit of an homage to horror and go through some things that I found interesting about it. So I divided this video into a few chapters. Firstly, I wanted to focus on what horror actually is, not only the genre, but the feeling of horror. Then I wanted to go through a bit of a history of horror and how it evolved through years, and for certain subgenres which books are important. And at the end I wanted to talk a bit about why we even want to read horror and what draws us into reading it, and what for me specifically is what is the reason that I'm so drawn to it and what it means to me. And lastly, I just want to give you some recommendations. I mean, this whole video is going to be full of recommendations, so if you want some recommendations for fall or ever that are horror, take out your pencils and notebooks because there's going to be a lot. To start, like I said, I wanted to just explain, give you basic definition of horror, what it actually is. So horror is a feeling of shock, fear, and disgust. It is a very subjective feeling if we're talking about it because, as you may realize from reading books, some people find things disgusting that others don't, and vice versa. So I think that for everyone it is a bit different, but still there are some things that are just objectively very scary, and most of the population thinks they are very scary. Now, if we're talking about genre of horror, the books that would be in this genre would probably be put under speculative fiction category, and these books have intentions to disturb the reader and often tackle some very difficult subjects that maybe other books won't be able to. I was interested in what common themes of all horror books are, and I found few. I found them on this blog. I will link every single thing that I used, every resource that I used in the descriptions if you want to read them. Check them out. I think they're interesting, all of them, and they really helped me to make this video. First one that we have is Fear of the Unknown. This one is very much used because it does make you connect with the characters. You, as the character in most horror books, are under this mystery, under this veil, and you do not know what is actually happening. And now you're sharing this with someone, and you both have this fear, so it makes you connect with the character a bit more. It makes you build a relationship with them. The other one that is kind of similar because it also kind of makes you connect with the character is Isolation. Now, I think that whilst reading horror books, this feeling of isolation I found mostly in some kind of paranormal activity horror books, when you have a character that realizes something is going on, or some kind of possession or anything like that, and they're trying to tell other people, look, this is happening, but it's so unrealistic that nobody really believes them. But you, as a reader, you are the only one who knows what is actually happening because you're literally reading what is happening. So again, it's something that makes you build a relationship with a character, and it's very used. The third one, and the most prevalent one, is death. Death is a theme that is very, very important for horror. It's in every single horror book out there. There is some kind of death, being death of a loved one or death as personified, something that you're trying to escape, but death is always in there. And I don't think that only death is something that is used. I think that aftermath of death is also very used in horror books. When you have somebody, that a loved one of the character that passed away recently, we are looking at how that affected them after this death happened. So I think that is also a very common theme. And the last one that I already mentioned but is important is supernatural elements or some kind of paranormal activity or anything. I feel like this theme is something that evolved a lot through time, especially because this is one of the oldest things that horror has. When you talk about horror creatures, they're all creatures that are already existing in some kind of stories. There are mostly folklore stories. These creatures were invented back then, and now we are reusing them in maybe some a bit different way, but still they are the same creatures and the same themes and the same topics. So this is very important if we're looking at how horror evolved and how it still has those traditional original things in it. If we're already on topic of folklore and going in history, let's go to our second chapter and see how horror evolved throughout the history and what were the first stories. Now, when I was searching for what was the first horror story, I was getting constantly the same result, and that was first horror novel, which is Castle of Otranto, and we're going to go back to it, but I was like, that is 18th century? You're telling me that there weren't any kind of horror stories before that one? Because I know they were. I mean, I know that they were folk tales at least, so what is the first horror story? Where were the first horror elements used? And then I came upon this blog, and on this blog, this guy was talking about how he thinks that the first horror story ever, or the first book with horror elements, was the first work itself, and that is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written 2100 years BC. I personally have not read the Epic of Gilgamesh. I didn't really plan to, but now maybe I will at some point. Firstly, what is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story, the synopsis of the story? In essence, it is the story of a Mesopotamian king named Gilgamesh who builds many wonders but is cruel to his people. To teach him a lesson, the gods create a wild man named Enkidu in the wilderness who later becomes a close friend of Gilgamesh and with whom Gilgamesh goes on many adventures fighting demons and monsters only to lose Enkidu to disease later. After Enkidu's demise, Gilgamesh seeks out Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian version of Noah, to see if he, Gilgamesh, can have eternal life. But the answer is no. Gilgamesh returns to his kingdom a wiser man. This blog post says, the Epic of Gilgamesh could perhaps best be described as a myth expressed as an epic poem with elements of horror. It was probably written more to express a certain philosophy or to record a myth than to entertain, which is the ultimate goal of horror novels and films. Nonetheless, it does contain elements of horror, particularly supernatural horror, and in the modern age, if it is read outside of a classroom, I think it will be read mostly for entertainment. So while it was not written as a novel, would it be accurate to say that the Epic of Gilgamesh is the first work of horror? If it is, then aficionados of the horror genre could state with pride that the first written work in any language was a work of horror. I mean, I would love to say that. I would love to be able to say that the first ever story was a horror story, but it was not. But it was a story still that had horror elements. Those horror elements including monsters, descriptions of the underworld, death, and grief and mortality, and also the gods themselves and how chaotic they are. Now, besides this one, I was interested in what else can we see in those early years. Were there any other works, especially Greek or Roman works, as they were kind of the oldest works that you read in high school. So were we able to read something that was horror? And I found that Greeks did write works of horror. You cannot put them in this genre of horror, but genre itself is very subjective. But they are works that have elements of horror. Now, some of them that I found were Parallel Lives by Plutarch, which have supernatural spirits. The tale of Anthenodorus Canonitas, who buys a haunted house in Athena by Pliny the Younger, and one that I remembered from high school, and that I think whenever we're talking about it, we are just talking about it as this poem, and that is The Divine Comedy by Dante. Now, this is not a Greek or Roman work, but it is a very famous work of literature which we still talk about to this day and which has really a lot of horror elements. I mean, the premise of the book is Dante going through hell and back. So Dante literally going through hell and back and seeing all the awful things happening to these humans in circles of hell and talking about death and mortality. I mean, I would say that could be put under works of horror, definitely. Which, when we think about it, as I said, we think about it as a classic work. But we forget that classic works also, if we're putting them in today's genre category, all are put under at least one genre. I spoke about folk tales and their existence and how they really impacted horror and how monsters from these folktales are still used, but I didn't really specify any, and I will not be doing that because there are so many folktales that I would feel awful if I were to mention one culture. But I still wanted to give you an example. So let's take The Witch of Berkeley, which was written by a monk named William in England at some point, and this story was made for, well, mostly to scare little kids and to scare them of going out at night so this witch doesn't take them. And now I don't know the complete folktale, but I just wanted to give you an example, and I wanted to say that all of these folktales and the original reason why they existed was to scare off people on going to woods, to dark places, somewhere alone without anyone else. And we see that a lot of creatures in these folktales are creatures that are coming out at night or coming out in like woods or somewhere else. Like, it's also something that is still out. I mean, the stories aren't told in the same way. Before, everybody would go around the fire and then the stories would be told. And although in the first few years they probably did serve as a kind of like a scare thing, afterwards they probably became fun. And horror books, as mentioned, are for fun. It's like entertainment, their entertainment purpose. It's still out there, and if you know anything about internet, you probably heard about creepypasta, which is people thinking and just making these characters up throughout the years. And I think that's really fun. And then those characters are sometimes used in horror stories. Even though now we talked about and mentioned some works with horror elements, we still didn't talk about a book that would be described as epitome of horror and what was then known and still known is Gothic horror. So, like I said, the first work of horror that is actually taken as the first ever horror novel is Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. It was written in 1764 when he was just 45 years old, and this is the original Gothic tale. I have not read it, sadly. I do plan to at some point, but this is the original. This is where everything else comes from. These Gothic elements that we're always talking about and that are becoming very popular again. So I found this documentation, how his friends reacted. He sent this novel to his friends in Cambridge, and I found how they like reported back what they thought about the book. Some of them cry a little and all in general afraid to go to bed o' nights, which I thought was hilarious that was a report. So people actually thought that this story was pretty scary, and probably in our standards today it wouldn't be that scary. But also what we have to realize is that this story takes a lot of spirits and necromancy. Miracles, visions, necromancy, dreams, and other preternatural events are exploded now, even from romances. That was not the case when our author wrote, much less when the story itself is supposed to have happened. Belief in every kind of prodigy was so established in those dark ages that an author would not be faithful to the manners of the times who should omit all mention of them. He's not bound to believe them himself, but he must represent his actors as believing them. If you are a lover of horror and you still have not read Castle of Otranto, I would say give it a go. Or even if it's your first time trying to read something horror, I think Castle of Otranto is something that you should read at some point. Castle of Otranto was first gothic horror novel, and at that point a lot of other authors that were seeing this and popularity of this book were also, you know what, let's write something like this. The genre of gothic horror started to evolve, and like I said, from this genre every single other subgenre evolved. Like if you're looking at it as a tree, the Castle of Otranto would be the stump, the body of the tree, and then everything else is kind of branching out of it. I still wanted to mention some other gothic horror books that made other subgenres evolve. The first one that came to my mind was Brother Grimm fairy tales. Again, another word that I don't think we actually associate with horror. We associate it with Disney and Disney princesses because a lot of Disney stories were taken from Brother Grimm, but if you ever read original Brother Grimm stories, they are not that happy. They don't even have happy endings, all of them. Like the same with Hans Christian Andersen's stories like Little Mermaid. They don't have happy endings at all, and they are pretty scary. I remember my parents read to me those stories when I was young, although they did leave out some parts that were terrifying, that would be terrifying then and probably still are now to me, but I love them. I love the original, and I even would say that I like original more than what Disney made of them, although Disney's are just classics as well, but there is something completely different. The originals have sisters cutting their feet off and man trapped in thorns and getting blinded. It's just this special atmosphere that these stories have, and from these stories I would say that dark grim fairy tales evolved, and dark grim as subgenre that is now used in horror and fantasy as well. You have so many dark grim fantasy books. The other one that is classic and very, very loved is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, or the other title that I never heard about before doing this video is The Modern Prometheus. I don't know, I never heard of this title, but I guess it makes sense. At the time that this book was written, horror books were more focused on terror than fear, and you can see this in how this book, descriptions of this book, how the labyrinthian house is described and Frankenstein's laboratory and every kind of sinister environment that he's in during the story that he's traveling through. And of course you have a poster boy of isolation and social prejudice, Frankenstein's monster himself. This was very important for evolving sci-fi and body horror as well. I mean, you have so much body horror in this book about Frankenstein's body parts and how he builds him. We cannot go through this without mentioning vampires. Vampires are something that is so popular. I feel like every few years it gets another surge in popularity. In the early 2000s it was popular because of the Twilight, and then I feel like a few years passed where it wasn't that popular. Other supernatural creatures like angel and werewolves and other things were popular, and then now, the last few years, again, vampires are very, very popular and becoming more and more, and there are so many new books coming out every single day about vampires. But the original vampire stories are very important to mention as well, like Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, which was one of the first, well, maybe the first, I don't know, I'm not sure about this, but LGBTQ stories with sapphic romance. And then of course Dracula by Bram Stoker. If you watch my channel, you know my feelings about Dracula are very controversial and not popular, but I'm still standing behind them. But I can also see why this book is very important for the involvement of vampire stories. Another one that is worth mentioning is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. The story that really stands the test of time. I read this book this year actually, completely, finally. And I have to say, it really surprised me how you can read this book in so many different ways and be focused on so many different things in this book, and it's very rereadable book. It talks a lot about artistry and morality. It also has that gothic atmosphere. It's so well written and I really truly love it. And whenever I'm looking at like videos about people recommending books, what books you should read if you want to get into horror or fall reads, I always see Dorian Gray somewhere in there, and I absolutely agree. If you have not read Dorian Gray, I mean, you should just go and read it now because it's also very approachable. It's really not hard to read. It's not one of those classics that you have to have a dictionary near you so you can understand what is happening, and you have to stop every few pages because it's just so thick. It's very easy to get through, but has so much to say. Also, one thing that I learned during this video is that this book, Dorian Gray, was actually inspired by another book that's called Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Maturin, and it was very inspiring for Oscar Wilde whilst reading Dorian Gray, so I do want to read that one at some point. Besides these books that are very, very popular, I also wanted to mention some that I read during years that are, some of them are again very, very popular, some not that much, but that are all in this gothic category. We can also put stories by Edgar Allan Poe and poems by Edgar Allan Poe in this category, as well as Henry James's story, H.P. Lovecraft, who is the father of cosmic stories, H.G. Wells, who again writes a lot of sci-fi and sci-fi horror, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who I don't think enough people are talking about. She wrote one of my favorite short stories of all time, The Yellow Wallpaper. It's like the epitome of psychological horror, which is another very important subgenre. As well as her, we have Shirley Jackson, who wrote Haunting on Hill House, and We Have Always Lived in a Castle, which is another very psychological book. Besides them, we also have Daphne du Maurier, which goes a little more into mystery, as well as stories by Thomas Ligotti, which is another author that I don't hear a lot of people talking about, but he really wrote amazing gothic stories and they are considered classics, although he's a bit more modern later in like 20th century, but still he still wrote gothic stories and I still like them a lot. Now, some of them that I have not read and I cannot talk about that much, but I still wanted to mention them, so I'm just going to mention them shortly. We have The Monk by Matthew Lewis, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, Zofloya by Charlotte Dacre, The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo, The Vampire by John Polidori, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers, Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux, and Stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I just wanted to mention them shortly so you know that there are so many others, and besides these ones, again, so many that I have not mentioned, but these are the ones that make me the most interesting to read them. I already said that genres, and especially subgenres, are very subjective. It's very hard to catalog and categorize books, especially in just one genre. I am never able to do that when I do it at home. It's very hard for me. Is this book more horror, or is this book more fantasy, or is this book more literary fiction? It's all very foggy to me, and I think that's just for everyone. You cannot categorize anything that's art. You cannot just categorize in one category. I feel like it always has something from another and something from another. So it was very hard to kind of think about what subgenres I would use and what subgenres I would talk about like as the main subgenres of horror. But I decided on the ones that I found the most on the internet when I was searching for it, and the ones that were just mentioned the most. The ones that were mentioned the most, as previously said, and now I talked about them a lot, is Gothic horror, very important one. Then we have psychological horror, that is focused more on emotional state of the characters, paranormal horror, body horror, fantasy horror, sci-fi horror, and slashers. There are some subgenres that I just feel like are too niche that I have not mentioned, but these are the most, I feel like these are the ones that you have the most books in, so most important, but again, not all of them, and don't take me for a word here. We already covered gothic horror, we already covered how sci-fi horror started and how paranormal horror started, but one subgenre that we still have not mentioned because until now it wasn't that popular is slashers and horror with serial killers in it. This genre started developing during 20th century. Extreme popularity of serial killers like Jack the Ripper or the Manson family, and because of these killers were so interested to the audiences and how they were thinking, this horror genre became also interesting and also started to become very, very popular. A lot of the books that I found that were start of this genre, I honestly didn't even know that they were books, and I'm calling myself a horror lover. I honestly didn't know that they were books. I just thought that they were movies, but a lot of movies coming out in these times were also firstly books, which I now know, so I can read them because I'm too scared to watch them actually. First one that I think is pretty important to mention is Psycho by Robert Bloch, which was written in 1959, and it was inspired by a serial killer named Ed Gein. Ed Gein was also known as Butcher of Plainfield, and he loved to dig up graves of his victims and then take parts of their bodies as safekeep. So this is what actually inspired Psycho. The other two that I think are pretty important to mention as well were written in the 80s by Thomas Harris, and those are the first book called Red Dragon, and the second book that is, I think most people know about this one, is The Silence of the Lambs. Another book that I thought was only the movie, and I feel really dumb about it now. Although those slashers were starting to become popular in the 20th century, there were also some books that existed before that had serial killers. One that I found was Confessions of Justified Sinners by James Hogg from 1824. This book takes place in Edinburgh, and it is about the serial killer in Edinburgh on a loose, and a detective trying to solve this case. So the other one that I wanted to mention that also became very popular in this time is a subgenre. It's like a subgenre of paranormal, and that is zombie horror and apocalyptic books themselves. Now I love apocalyptic books. I love great apocalyptic books. I always loved them. But zombie stories, not that. I'm not that well met with them. The start of these ones was a little bit earlier because of H.P. Lovecraft. He wrote a lot of short stories, some of them including zombified people like Cool Air and The Vault and The Outsiders, but this is when they really took root and started growing a bit more in popularity with I'm Legend by Richard Madison. Another book that I thought was only a movie. Of course, I cannot not mention Stephen King. If I was about to talk about every single book that he ever wrote and which category that book would go into, we would be here for a few hours at least. The man wrote over 200 stories. It's insane how much books this man wrote. It's absolute insanity. I don't even know how somebody can have that many stories in their head, but he wrote them. And now we have them, and he really paved the way for a lot of horror authors, and he did bring horror to a wider audience, and it became even more popular, and he really made this genre like worldwide famous. The first book that he ever wrote was Carrie, his debut that was published in 1974. This is a book about periods. I mean, it's not periods exactly, but it is the most famous for The Bucket of Blood, and it has something to do with periods and teenage girls, so okay. I have not read it. The only two books that I read by Stephen King for now are The Misery and Pet Sematary. Both of them I thought were mid, but also he is a cult classic author, and I do plan to read more books by him, and I do think that at least one of them I will like, because I mean there are so many that I can pick from. I also wanted to just mention shortly another author that I feel made something very important, a breakthrough, and that is Ira Levin, who wrote Rosemary's Baby and Stepford Wives. The Rosemary Baby was actually one of the first books that kind of brought horror into the city. Until then, horror books would mostly take place somewhere outside in like some kind of village or in the woods, but they weren't in the city. And when he brought it in the city, it started becoming popular because, okay, now you're telling us that this is something that can happen to us here. And I read Rosemary's Baby. I really, really loved it. Have not read Stepford Wives, but just wanted to mention him as well. That was long. I have 2 more chapters left. So in this one, like I said, I wanted to focus a bit more on why we read horror, what draws us in reading horror or experiencing it or watching it in any kind of way, what actually attracts us to things that are so vile and disgusting, and why do we continue to read it? There is a neuropsychological reason. We get an adrenaline rush when something spooks us or something scary happens, which releases endorphins and dopamine. So, put simply, there is a chemical process that creates a similar sense of euphoria. Some say that having a scary ghost experience is like being on a roller coaster. We are hijacking the natural flight response and enjoying it. There was a research done by, I'm going to look up the name, so Maldorf Anderson and his colleagues at Aarhus University's Recreational Fear Lab. They studied a group of people that was put into one of those fear-inducing haunted houses. They were monitoring them whilst this experience was happening, and at the end, the conclusion was that there is a sweet spot. And this sweet spot is where the chemical reaction happens. So the findings indicated that humans don't enjoy being too far from their normal psychological state, but they do enjoy being just a little bit out of their comfort zone. Our results suggest that there might be a sweet spot between fear and enjoyment, says Malmdorf Anderson. A just right spot where the context is not too terrifying but not too tame either. The sweet spot seems to be where enjoyment is maximized. I guess we all have a sweet spot of horror, and something that's not mentioned here, but this sweet spot is different from each of us, and that's why some of us find certain things scarier than others. I think that if we're looking at all the reasons why we want to get scared and why we like reading this, first one, the adrenaline rush that you have, that was just, explained how it works. Then sense of control, if in controlled environment, and reading horror is definitely a controlled environment. You can just put the book down whenever you want to. Then we have emotional catharsis, which makes you able to put out all the emotions that you were collecting inside of you, and now you can just let them out because something triggered them, and sometimes it's very satisfying to cry or to scream or to be angry. One that I mentioned in my first chapter when I was talking about isolation and the fear of an knowable is this social aspect, this social bonding that you don't only have with the characters that you're reading, but you also have with other people that read the book, or other people that watched the movie, or other people in this haunted house, when you all scream at the same time, or you're reading reviews and everybody are saying, oh yeah, that part also made me cry, or that part also made me really, really scary. And that's something that also makes you kind of want to read it so you can experience what other people are also experiencing. The next one is sense of accomplishment. This is one that I'm not really doing that much because I'm not reading about things that really scare me the most, but I know some people like to, and then they feel accomplished because they're not that scared of that thing anymore and they kind of conquered it in their head. They read about it and it's like fine now, but for example, for me, I have some phobias. I still have not read books that are like those phobias. I have phobia of sea. I have thalassophobia. I hate deep water, and still I don't think I ever read a book that was in like depths horror book. Other two are cultural context. In some cultures is just something that's culturally acceptable. I don't know that much about that aspect, but also escapism, which I will talk about a bit more, but for now let's just put it here, escapism. I was interested in this is morbid curiosity. This is colloquially described as interest in things that are morbid and unpleasant, like death. There is not a lot of research that I found on this, but I did find that one of the first works that was done was by these two scientists named Zuckerman and Little, who were trying to search what this phenomenon really is, and they came up with this scale that is called Curious About Morbid Events, or CAME in short. And this scale was used to track which level of morbid curiosity people are, on which level they are, right? But it's not used anymore that much. Reason why is because originally the scale was made with questions that mostly asked people about experiences that they witnessed violence, something violent happening. That's not what morbid curiosity always is. Thinking about it in sense of books and in sense of horror books or mystery books, or I mean any kind of books, we are not curious about the act of something happening. We are curious about the path that character or the story takes to this happening. So when you're reading a mystery novel, when the mystery is revealed, you do not feel that compelled to continue the story. I mean, you will, because it's probably somewhere at the end, so you will finish it. But as soon as the mystery part is revealed, you're not that curious anymore. And that is what morbid curiosity is. It makes you curious about how did this awful event happen, and then it gets revealed, and then you're like, okay, so it's the path that we want to reveal, not the violence itself. So that's why this is not used anymore, because it just didn't really make sense for what it was used for. Now, besides being entertainment and for entertainment purposes, or we're just curious about something, it also makes you more knowledgeable, as any kind of curiosity does. But this one is very important because when you're having morbid curiosity, you witness things that are violent, you witness experiences that are violent and not very pleasant, and then you know about them and you know how to act when they really happen to you. Lastly, I wanted to talk about why I personally read horror books. Besides all of these things that I mentioned, why people gravitate toward it, I wanted to mention my personal experience with horror. As I said in the beginning, it's something that I always loved and something that really molded me as a person. But when I was asking myself the question, why do I want to read it? Why do I continue reading it? Even if it's hard for me at parts, even if it makes me really angry and upset sometimes. And I came up with this answer that I don't know if it makes sense, but it is what I came up with, and that is censorship. When I talk about censorship, I mean in the way of censoring people to speak, or books kind of wrapping things in with little bows so they are nice to consume and there's nothing really scary happening, or everything is nicely described. And horror books don't do that. When you pick up a horror book, you don't think about it in a way that, okay, this is going to be a nice little cozy experience. No, you picked it up and you expect gross and gruesome things and hard things that it will tackle. Especially in the last few years and like last year, books overall have been censored a lot. Books have been banned and taken off shelves of libraries. A lot of books that just some people don't agree with, which I think it's completely fine if you do not agree with what books has to say, or if you hate it. That's valid and that's fine, but it's not reason enough to take it off and not let other people to have that experience of not agreeing or agreeing with the book. You're just taking experiences away from people, and it's all kind of put under this umbrella of, oh, we have to protect our kids, or it's not appropriate for average consumer. And of course there are some books that I would never give to my little brother or sisters to read now at this point, because it's just, they're R-rated. But that's why R rating exists, so we know that, okay, this is not for this person now, but it could be in the future. Taking and banning books makes everything rated R-rated for everyone, and nobody can nobody can get to it. And I don't agree with that at all. Like I said, you don't have to agree with something and you do not need to love the book, but the book still has enough reason to exist. It's a work of art, it's someone's thoughts, and even if those thoughts anger you, we all have freedom of speech, and if that person wanted to write that, they can. Now, I'm not talking about the books that are straight up lying about certain things, facts, history. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about fictional books that just have their own opinion and their look on the world and how it could be in a few years. And if you're looking at these lists of banned books, you will see that a lot of these books actually do that. They are books about future of the world. There are books about political regimes and about LGBTQ or about anything that is a bit scarier. When I looked at it, like Brave New World or Slaughterhouse-Five or Parable of the Sower, Fahrenheit, they're all books that have been banned in a lot of libraries, but they are also books that have a lot of important things to say. I don't want that. I don't want that censorship in the books, and the books that I mentioned now are all the books that I read or I'm planning to read at some point in my life, but I don't want that censorship. And horror books are books that really don't do that. They really don't censor. Sometimes I even think it's a bit too much, but I still am grateful that there is that is not censored. The human emotions are raw, and horror books are the books that give me the most realistic depictions of racism and homophobia, transphobia, violence, grief, classism, abuse, every single thing that is awful, and it doesn't wrap it within a little present. It's just there, and it's hard to read. It gives you realism, and that's what I like. Even though you wouldn't connect realism with horror, to me, that is it. Because it doesn't have to do those things. It doesn't have to censor it. It's a horror book. That's what you expect from it. That's what I expect from it. That's why I love it. That's why I read it. When I read horror books, it makes me see people that I would probably firstly never meet in the real life, and secondly people that I don't have that much in common with, people that when I see them on the street I will probably not be able to understand them. But now when I am like reading about people that are like that, it makes me more empathetic to people who are different than me, to people who experience world in different ways than me and who think about things in different ways than me. And I think that's really special to me, and that's something that really molded me. I mentioned escapism earlier, and I wanted to come back to it. So reading to escape is something that a lot of people do. It's why I started reading at the first place. But I don't think it's possible to escape. Every single book that exists out there is a book that took from reality. And even if you're reading some kind of fantasy with completely different world and completely different magic system, and the humans aren't even humans, but are some kind of other race or species, there is still a bit of reality in it. There's still emotions that they feel that are emotions that humans feel. They also have political regimes that we do. They have a lot of similarities to us, and personally, even if I want to read a book just to escape reality and read something that is so completely different, I still find things to take from that book. I still find things that maybe I agree with, but maybe I don't. I completely disagree with, and that's fine. That's my own opinion. I can think whatever I want, even if everyone else thinks it's the best book. I can think differently. But yeah, I just wanted to say that I don't think escapism is something that you can accomplish completely for any book, and especially horror books. Horror books, although they sound like escapism, they also tackle very difficult subjects. Especially the horror books that I read tackle some very, very difficult subjects, and I am now going to be mentioning some of the horror books that I think you should be reading. That came out in the last 20 years, as I said in the beginning. I think all of these books are good. Some of them are my favorite books of all time. Maybe you will not agree with any of them. Maybe you will find one that you like, but these are just books that I think are worth mentioning. Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Sadavi shows mass death and chaos in Iraq since US occupation. When the Reckoning Comes by Latanya McQueen and The Deep by River Solomon are about the consequences of slavery and plantations. I Was a Teenage Slasher by Stephen Graham Jones, about an indigenous character becoming a slasher against his will. Tinfoil Butterfly by Rachel Eve Moulton, about substance abuse and domestic violence. Diary of Blood by S.T. Gibson and Sour Cherry by Natalie Theodoridou are also depicting domestic violence. Rouge by Mona Wad, very mysterious story about beauty industry. Then there is The Flesh by Agustina Bastorica, about consumerism and meat industry. Monstrilio by Gerardo Solano Cordova and Brat by Gabrielle Smith. Both have unique but realistic depictions of grief. The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez are short stories tackling various socio-political themes. She's Always Hungry by Eliza Clark, many different topics of feminism, beauty industry, consumerism. Moonflow by Peter Corella and The Brainworms by Alison Rumfit, both I read very recent and enjoyed. And Brainworms inspired me to make this video, so thank you to Alison Rumfit. But why this book inspired me is because it is a very disgusting book. I'm not it's a bad book, but it's disgusting, and even at parts author is talking to you as a reader between lines, between paragraphs, and telling you, okay, if you think this was disgusting, maybe you should stop for now and just take a little break, because it's about to get a lot more and a lot harder to read. And it made me realize, okay, why am I still reading this? Now I know why I read it. Also, both of those books tackle similar subjects of transphobia. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching this video. It really means a lot. I know it's a little bit different than my usual videos, but I just really wanted to make it, and it means a lot to me to be able to talk about these things. I always want to hear your thoughts. If you have any recommendations, if you have any thoughts on anything that I talked about, especially in this last part where I talked about why people read horror and why I read horror, I'm interested in why you read horror as well, and if you do or if you don't, that's also fine. But yeah, thank you so much for watching my homage to horror genre, and I hope it wasn't too boring. I hope it wasn't too long. Please tell me if you liked it, so I know for future if I can continue maybe sometimes doing these kind of videos, because I had a lot of fun researching for this one. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!